I hope you're having a great day. Welcome to this session. My name is Rosa. I'm from the EA Sydney Group, and I'm really delighted to welcome Courtney Henry today to speak to us about wild animals and promoting concern for them internationally. So Courtney works for Animal Ethics, conducting research on expanding concern for wild animals in China. She leads the Effective Altruism Group in Perth and co-organises the Perth Vegan Expo. She also ran for the Australian Senate this year with the Animal Justice Party. And a reminder again to please post your questions on Hoover so we can discuss them at the end of the session. All right, please welcome Courtney.
Thanks very much. It's really exciting for me to be here. I was sitting in the audience of EAGx Melbourne myself last year and was so inspired that I wanted to get involved, and I began interning with Animal Ethics and then was brought on as a researcher for them this year. So a big thank you to the organisers both this year as well as last year. So a summary of what I'm going to be talking about today. I'll briefly introduce wild animal suffering as a cause area, but this isn't designed to be an introductory talk. Then I'll go on to talk about who animal ethics are and some of the research that we're doing in terms of promoting concern for wild animals internationally. And then I'll talk briefly on some opportunities for involvement. So why care about wild animals? There's behavioural, physiological and evolutionary evidence to suggest that non-human animals can have positive as well as negative experiences and therefore can experience positive well-being as well as suffer, and this gives us reason to give them moral consideration. So many of you are likely to agree with this, and the thing which may immediately jump to mind are animals which suffer as a result of direct human interaction, for example by factory farming or laboratory experimentation, so on and so forth. But you may not have considered animals which suffer in the wild as a result of natural harms. And this includes many young animals who may die prematurely. For example, sea turtles, only a few of them live to reach maturity. Most of them die after only a few weeks. There's some quite graphic imagery of animal suffering on the next few slides, so just a warning in case you wanted to look away. So many people have an idyllic view of nature, but there are many ways in which animals suffer in the wild. Disease, parasitism, malnutrition, thirst, physical injuries. This is a rabbit with the myxomatosis virus, a starving polar bear, and a deer with a screwworm infestation. The number of animals in the wild is very large, so I thought I'd create a little pictorial just so you can roughly visually see the scale here. So I've got the human population as being roughly 1 dot, and then land farmed animals being approximately 10 times that. And then we've got some estimates from Brian Tomasic, and they're very speculative estimates, and they're also very wide-ranging. You can see there's an estimate between 10 times the human population and 10,000 times. So that's something that we're really unsure about. And then for wild marine vertebrates, would be estimates between 1,000 and 100,000 times or even more. And for invertebrates, orders of magnitude above that. So it's just an idea to give you the scale of the problem. It's enormous. So considering the scale and neglectedness of the problem, one could argue that there's a very high value of research within this area. So we want to encourage further research, but in order to get more research done, we firstly need to promote concern. No one wants to research something they're not concerned about. So one could argue that advocating for wild animals and capacity building is something that really needs to happen in this space. And Brian Tomasic argues that as well, that by getting people to think about and care about wild animal suffering will generate further research in the field. A common response when people hear about wild animal suffering, and certainly one that I had when I first heard about it, was that it may seem strange or unusual to positively improve the lives of animals living in the wild. But it's rather, there are some really nice examples of interventions that we can do to improve the lives of wild animals. I'll show you some examples. Vaccination is a really compelling example. So this shows the vaccination of wild boars against tuberculosis. That's a study about that. This one's the vaccination of wild boars against swine fever virus. And vaccinating foxes against rabies. So if you have a look at the date of some of this research, some of these interventions have been happening for decades, and rabies was eliminated from Europe and large areas of North America by 2010. So that's quite a nice example of a wild animal suffering intervention. It was administered through the aerial dispersal of baits containing the rabies vaccine. And this is a nice example of a wild animal suffering intervention in China. So 2,000 peacocks were vaccinated in the Yunnan Wild Animal Park in 2010. So while many of these were done because they also help humans, they also show that we can, positively participate in nature to improve the lives of wild animals. So that's a little bit of an introduction to wild animal suffering. I'll move along to animal ethics and some of the research that we're doing within this space. So animal ethics was formed to provide information and promote discussion about issues relevant in animal ethics as a field, and to provide resources for animal advocates, and the vision being a world where all sentient beings are given consideration. And so this also includes beings who will live in the future. So some of the work that we want to do is by spreading awareness, promoting concern, and also promoting practical interventions which could assist animals in the long term. And to this aim, we're interested in promoting concern for wild animals globally. So we're a global organisation with researchers and interns working remotely across many countries. So sometimes organising meetings can be difficult with the time zones. Mass outreach isn't really our focus. Rather, it's promoting concern in intellectual communities such as the effective altruism community, or amongst academics, or also animal advocates who are already concerned about animals, just getting more awareness to them as well. So moving on to our work in China, before I move on to the wild animal suffering piece, I thought I'd discuss a little bit about the farmed animal welfare piece as well, because there's already been some work happening in this space within the effective altruism community, so it's just by way of a bit of introduction. So China recently became the world's largest consumer of factory farmed animals, so it consumes about a quarter of the world's total. This is a diagram from the Food and Agricultural Organization of the United Nations, and this is for millions of tons of animals consumed per year. And you can see, having a look at the scale there, compared to other countries, China consumes a large number of land farmed animals. And this one is for cows, pigs, chicken, sheep and goats. So not given in this figure are estimates for fish production, which were estimated by the United States Agricultural Department to be 70 million tonnes in 2017. And 80,000 Hours, being an effective altruism aligned organisation which provides career advice, also started recommending China specialist as a high impact career path, and within this space promoting concern for farmed animals. And the Open Philanthropy Project has also funded a number of grants within this space as well. So that's just some of the work that's been done in the China piece within the effective altruism community to date. So now I'll talk a bit about wild animal suffering as a cause area in terms of our cause prioritisation framework, scale, neglectedness and tractability or solvability. Firstly, scale. So with a population of 1.4 billion, China is the world's most populous country. It has the world's second largest economy and it's the fourth largest in the world by area. And that's with estimates including 10% of the world's mammal species and 14% of the world's vertebrate species. I don't know about what that means in terms of total numbers of animals. There are no estimates I've seen for that. And also we don't have any estimates for invertebrates either. So that's some research that I would love to see. So the views towards non-human animals in China are likely to affect vast numbers of both farmed and wild animals. And with China's rising influence, it can affect, policy internationally through foreign investment, diplomacy, and trade. So the views towards non-human animals in China will both directly and indirectly affect many animals in the world. A bit on neglectedness. Considering its immense size and influence, the animal protection space within China is very neglected. It could be argued to be very neglected, and with work on wild animal suffering as a cause area being virtually non-existent. So there are currently only a handful of international organisations with a significant presence in China. And a majority of the wild animal suffering work has taken place within Europe and the Americas. So it could be argued that as there is less work within the animal defence space in China as compared to the West, that this presents a unique opportunity for us to promote concern for wild animals there. So in the West, there's been a large proportion of the animal defence movement focusing on certain categories of animals, for example, companion animals with respect to donors. So this is a diagram by animal charity evaluators, and it shows that 66% of the donations in the US go to companion animal shelters, even though only 0.03% of domesticated land animals are killed in such shelters. And so, although many Chinese organisations are similar to their Western equivalents in terms of their sole focus for companion animals, one could argue that the animal defence space is comparatively vacant and the views towards animals less formed, as well as the government's awareness of animal issues only recently beginning to grow. So therefore, there's an opportunity to incorporate a concern for wild animals in what could be argued are the early stages of China's animal protection movement. And fostering a concern for wild animals and animal advocates, as well as the EA community in China, may be a good way forward for future work on wild animal suffering there. So, whether wild animal suffering work is more tractable in China compared to the West remains to be seen. One could say that in the West there are already established institutions and ideas about animals, but also there may be more people in the West who are willing to work on wild animal suffering. And also there are fewer political constraints as well. So that's something that we're just really unsure about in terms of the comparative tractability. So one of the main goals of our research has been to figure out how best to incorporate a concern for wild animal suffering in the development of concern for animals and the advocacy movement within China. So I've been doing very early exploratory research with a colleague based in China, Vincent Chow. And in this very early stage, we're just trying to understand the current state of the animal protection movement, the logistics of an international not-for-profit operating there, and using that to help inform whether or not we should work there. So as part of our initial research, we conducted 13 exploratory interviews with people in, within international not-for-profits as well as local not-for-profits. I won't go too much into the operational or logistical aspects of things, nor the political. I'd be more comfortable if you spoke to me about that one-on-one. I'm happy to answer questions at any stage during the weekend or during office hours. But we're still conducting interviews and the literature review is still in progress. I also recently had the opportunity to run a focus group with some international Chinese students studying at UWA. That's parallel research, it's not part of animal ethics overall research, and the results are very preliminary. I wouldn't put too much credence in them. Obviously, you'd want to run like a series of focus groups and pair it with things like surveys, but I thought I'd just mention some of the preliminary results because some of the themes were related. So these are a result of a search of articles to do with animal rights, welfare, conservation and policy, and so on in China. And I thought I'd just show this to demonstrate that there's an increasing concern for the well-being of animals within the academic literature over the years. So if you have a look, the 2010 to 2019 period, there were 92 academic articles published compared to just 6 in 1980 to 1989. So that's quite encouraging within the academic space. It should be noted these are articles in English and a lot of these are by Western authors, but our researcher in China is currently doing the Chinese literature review as well. So I'm excited to see the results of that. And they're not exhaustive, but yeah, it's just still kind of nice to see those trends. So now moving on to some of the themes which emerged as part of the exploratory interviews as well as in the literature. An unsurprising theme which emerged was the concern for charismatic wild animals, which is similar to the West and the animal defence movement here, such as the panda and the tiger. So you can see 18% of the literature, the articles were about panda, 14% were about the tiger, which is quite large in terms of the proportion of an entire body of literature on a subject. And one of our interviewees indicated that if the panda were discovered sick or dying, it would receive immediate attention, and this is something that's supported on a government level. This was also a theme which emerged in the focus group where participants indicated that the panda, being like a national symbol, receives a lot of concern and care. And the participants also indicated that as they don't have an opportunity to observe non-urban wild animals, they couldn't really think of many wild animals or name them off the top of their head. It's just something which I'm interested in is whether a concern for these more charismatic wild animals could be expanded to concern for other animals living in the wild as well. So another interesting feature of the academic literature that you can see here is that 60% of the literature were regarding conservation efforts, and I thought I'd just mention that here because it's sort of semi-reflective of the animal defence space there, where with respect to wild animals, the concern being for those animals is intricately linked with conservation. Another theme which emerged from the interviews were ideas about how to communicate, with people regarding animal protection or animal defence. Wild animal, and I apologise if my pronunciation of this is not very good, but Yesheng Dongwu. And it was mentioned that Dongwu, being the Chinese word for animal, directly translates as moving object. And so some of the interviewees indicated that they would modify their materials to use pronouns instead, such as he or she when referring to animals. And also animal welfare translates into Chinese as the animal being entitled to something very luxurious, like a holiday. So that's also seen some international not-for-profits modifying their names significantly to make their intentions clear when operating in China. And there was a recent survey of 6,000 Chinese citizens to get their perceptions of animal welfare, and 36.6% of respondents indicated that they weren't aware of the concept or hadn't heard of the concept. Many of the interviewees advised that working with officials directly was a preferable approach to operating in China compared to directly engaging with the public or mass outreach. And a caution was advised when using things like, advocacy or translating that, or in, translating ideas like campaigning for rights. So, while ideas pertaining to animal protection and animal defence in China may be relatively new there, treating animals with kindness and mercy is very much within different schools of Chinese philosophical and religious thought. So, for example, Chinese Buddhism promotes the idea that all beings are equal and encourages vegetarianism and the freeing of captive animals. Taoism promotes that mercy be given to all beings, and Confucianism suggests no harm. So something that I would be interested in would be to know what kind of implications these things have to the animal defence space there and what it means for the animal protection movement there generally. So moving on from China to India, a lot of the things I mentioned for China in terms of the scale and neglectedness can also be applied to India. So we had an intern do a similar study to myself, conducting interviews, conducting a literature review, and I'll quickly mention some of the themes that I found interesting. But if you have any questions about that work, I'd be happy to put you in touch with the intern who did that research. Similar to China, in India it seems that with respect to wildlife, a concern for wild animals is closely connected with conservationism. And one of the themes that emerged, which I found interesting, was compassionate conservation, which are conservation efforts that take place and they take consideration of the welfare of the animals within their efforts. So that's a very interesting avenue for further research that I think might be interesting to explore. Something which I thought was quite noteworthy that there are some protections offered to animals within the Constitution of India itself, as well as within the Indian Penal Code. And we also have the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals Act 1960 and the Wildlife Protection Act of 1972. The penalties associated with the penal code are very minor because they haven't been adjusted for inflation since the 1970s. So very small fines. And there's also the Animal Welfare Board of India, which looks into the protection of animals as well. So finally, in case you're interested, there are some exciting opportunities with animal ethics at the moment. We're giving out grants for anyone who's who would be interested in doing a master's in the life sciences, promoting the well-being of animals, or just looking into their well-being generally. And so applications for that close by November 1st. There are also 2 internship rounds per year, and not just within the life sciences. There's also communications, visual media, looking into the legal situation of animals. This is how I started with animal ethics as an intern, working on their Global Perspectives project before being brought on as a researcher. I thought I'd mention this. This was a really nice literature review done by one of the interns on invertebrate sentience. And so that's a really nice piece that I'd recommend looking at. It's available on the website. And so to conclude, we want to generate more research in the space of wild animal suffering, and in order to do that we need to promote concern. And in terms of what that means in India and China, there's still a lot we don't know about the animal protection movements there, but watch this space, we're continuing research. And sometimes the scale of these problems can be a bit overwhelming, and as with many effective altruism cause areas, but I always feel uplifted after spending time with like-minded individuals who are looking to help the world. So thank you very much for coming along. Feel free to approach me at any stage during the weekend, or email info@animalethics.org. And yeah, thanks for your time.
Thank you very much, Courtney, and thank you for all of your questions that are coming through. There were a few that all asked about the impact on ecosystems of helping some animals, so wondering whether helping turtles would then change the ecosystem because they're not meant to survive, or... Yeah, I think that's a summary of the first three questions.
Yeah, for sure. Look, that's one of the things that just needs a lot more research, really. For us to be able to positively intervene in the wild, we need to make sure that we're not going to have negative flow-on effects. So that's very much like an ongoing area of research that we're working on. Yeah.
Thanks. And what is your position on the suffering of some animals for the benefit of many, e.g. when animals are used for veterinary research or when invasive species are targeted for culling?
So the way I think about this personally is basically whatever situation you can think of, replace it with a human. And so, is it, for example, to preserve biodiversity, it might be a good idea to, let's say, wipe out populations of humans because they're clearing the Amazon. But we clearly wouldn't do that. We would find a better way, right? And so it's all to do with expanding our moral concern to include the well-being of animals in a similar way. Yeah. Oh, no, thank you. Yeah.
Most people in the world don't yet show much concern for farmed animals. Do you think we should focus on wild animal welfare now due to their greater numbers, or would it be better to first get people on board with helping farmed animals before tackling the problem of wild animal suffering?
That's a great question. I think we should work on both. And some people argue that it depends on whether you have more of a near-termist concern versus a long-termist concern as well. So I guess if some people say that if you're more concerned about the near term, potentially factory farming might be a better place for you to be. But if you're very concerned about the long-term future, wild animal suffering may be a place for you to work as well. And also wild animal suffering is extremely neglected. But when you help in the farmed animal welfare space as well, that will also indirectly help wild animals. So it's one of those things. I think we shouldn't do both, and we should do both. But I don't think we should just work on factory farming and not work on wild animal suffering until that's figured out. I think we can work on both at the same time.
Thank you. Are you working on any aspects of wildlife suffering in Australia, such as kangaroo suffering from the hands of humans?
No, and that's actually something that I think would be great to look at. So if anyone wants to do an internship with animal ethics, reach out to me.
And is there much hope for convincing conservationists to care about wild animal suffering for the animal's sake rather than to preserve the species or ecosystem?
I think maybe just exploring the areas of compassionate conservation, where we could both consider the welfare of the animals within the habitat, as well as wanting to preserve the overall habitat, is something that definitely warrants further exploration. And maybe, we could have that discussion and that conversation with conservationists.
And a good follow-on question, how do you think about the moral weight of species extinction? Are there any frameworks for comparing the suffering of individual animals against extinction and biodiversity loss?
That's a very interesting question. In terms of it's quite a complicated question. Some would argue that biodiversity is something that's valued as a bit more of a human aesthetic. that, us kind of valuing that is something that we're sort of imparting upon the ecosystem, as opposed to caring about like total numbers of animals and the welfare of those animals. But yeah, like it's one of those things, like, there's ways we can hopefully, with further research, like help the animals at the same time as preserving biodiversity.
Do you have examples of possible low-cost and large-scale interventions that could be rolled out in this cause area? Could you speak more about how this is having an effective impact?
So a really nice example of a fairly large-scale intervention, which was done, I think, it's been taking place over a few decades. In terms of like large scale, I think the general consensus of the community is that we would focus on looking at small-scale interventions, making sure they don't have negative flow-on effects to the ecosystems before we do something really large-scale. So it's very much about like getting research and promoting practical interventions that maybe we can do in the short term to medium term that would give people some hope and, maybe motivation that actually, yes, there is something we can do to improve the lives of wild animals. And then in the long term, maybe we can roll out some much larger scale interventions. But I guess like a nice example would be like vaccination programs like the Foxes Against Rabies, or even I think recently they were able to help through placing like a contraceptive, like it was an immunocontraceptive gene within the screwworm flies to reduce their populations, and that really helped to reduce the incidence of screwworm infestations in mammals within, I believe, the Americas. This was done, and that was a very successful, quite large-scale intervention there.
Excellent. Do you think that natural ecosystems are generally morally net positive? i.e., might the world have less suffering if we wiped out wild animals, ignoring effects on humans?
I wouldn't know is the short answer for that. That's like, that's something that's like quite a large, philosophical question, I think, yeah.
Okay, that is all of the questions I have on Hoover. We've got time for one more question. Is there a question? Yes.
Yeah, so one of the people asked the 3 questions about how do you know what the impacts are going to be on ecosystems more broadly. You say we need to do more research, but it sounds like you're already doing some interventions. How do you know that, for example, even this intervention isn't having negative, by increasing the population of deer, maybe the deer starve, maybe they predate, whatever?
Yeah, no.
I'll just repeat the question for the video, or summarise it. So the question was that there's already some interventions being done, and how do we know even those ones at a small scale are not having a negative impact on ecosystems?
That's a great question. Like, I don't know if they studied flow-on effects to ecosystems as part of that intervention, so I'm afraid I wouldn't be able to tell you for these studies. But a nice example would be like, for example, let's say, animals, they may have like a bit of chronic pain and chronic suffering, but it doesn't like overall affect their population. Doing something like, relieving their parasitism or some of their pain, probably wouldn't really have major flow-on effects. Yeah.
Excellent. Thank you very much for that very interesting speech, and thank you to everyone for all of your questions. Courtney's office hours are this afternoon from 4:15, so please continue the discussion with her then. We hope you enjoy the rest of the conference, and let's once again thank Courtney for the great speech.